Miss Diane Abbott.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak to this House this afternoon about the issues to do with racial violence, and in particular, the issues arising from the recent brutal killing of the black schoolboy Stephen Lawrence in South East London. The black men and women who came to this country in the 50s and 60s went through very difficult times and had to work very hard to keep themselves and their families together. But they always believed, and they kept themselves going with the notion that for their children it would be better. Because classically, the hope of the immigrant, whether they are black immigrants or Jewish immigrants or Somalian immigrants or Turkish immigrants, the hope of the immigrant down the ages has been invested in their children. So the fact that there's been this recent spate of killing of black school children in South East London, and the killing of Stephen Lawrence in particular, is, I think, distinctly cruel. Because in the way that black school children are being slaughtered, it is as if this society is throwing a community's hopes back in its face. Now, I do not want to talk in detail about the Stephen Lawrence case because it is obviously sub judice, but I want to stress that the Stephen Lawrence killing was not a matter of gang warfare. It was not a matter of some long-running feud between rival adolescents. He was an innocent schoolboy waiting by a bus stop who was stabbed to death by a gang of 6 white youths. Stephen Lawrence was the type of young man that we all want our children to turn out to. He was ambitious, he was studying at school, he was doing 7 GCEs, he wished to become an architect, and he came from an exemplary, hard-working, dignified black family. Now, since the killing, there's been a great deal of talk about how political activists have exploited the case. But the point I want to make is this, that before the community got involved, before people started to organise, before people started to march, it was as if the killing was being ignored, particularly by the media. And I want to extend to Stephen Lawrence's family my personal commiserations, and I also want to thank Nelson Mandela, the head of the ANC in South Africa, who took the trouble when he was visiting England a few weeks ago to actually visit the Lawrence family, and I know from speaking to them that they found meeting him highly inspirational. Now, the killing of Stephen Lawrence would be bad enough if it was an isolated incident, but it comes on top of a spate of killings of young black men in that area. In February 1991, 15-year-old Roland Adam was stabbed. In May 1991, 25-year-old Orville Blair was stabbed. In July 1992, 16-year-old Rohit Dougal was stabbed, and Rohit Dougal was stabbed just 200 yards away from where Stephen Lawrence was to be stabbed a few months later. And these killings are just part of a pattern of racial harassment and violence that we are seeing nationally. In Hackney, my own constituency, not a week goes by when people do not come to see me to talk about the racial harassment and the violence they're suffering. I see people all the time who are frightened to leave their own homes. Very often we're talking about women and children. They're being spat on, they're being abused, they're finding their flats and their houses covered in graffiti, they find excreta pushed through their letterboxes. I've seen families that every morning take their children to school in a cab, not because it's a long way away, not because they can afford to take their children to school in a cab, but because they're so frightened of the violence and harassment that they find just walking along the street. And this just isn't just an issue for the black and Asian community. In Hackney, which has traditionally been an area of Jewish settlement, the Jewish community, and in particular the Hasidic community, is also suffering from increasing levels of harassment and violence. And as I say, this is a problem, not just in London, but a problem nationally, and it's a problem that's on the rise. And what I wish to say to the House this afternoon is the black community in Britain want an end to this harassment. They want an end to the violence and the killings. And the black community wants actions. Local councils must act. Local councils must be willing to act far more quickly and far more effectively against tenants who harass other council tenants. In particular, Bexley Council must act to close down once and for all the British National Party headquarters that are in its borough, because it is no coincidence that the killings that I have listed in South East London have all taken place within 3 or 4 miles of that British National Party headquarters. And I'm sorry to say that the black community in South East London feel, perhaps incorrectly, but they do feel that it is the fact that Bexley is a Tory council which has led it to be so insensitive to the fears of black, ethnic minority and Jewish people about the fact that the fascists are allowed to have a headquarters in the middle of the borough. Bexley has claimed it doesn't have the powers to close down this HQ. Well, I believe that even within the planning law, Bexley has the powers. And I say to Bexley Council this afternoon, how many more black school children have to be killed before Bexley makes a move to close down that fascist HQ? But this isn't a matter for councils alone. It's also a matter for government. And I'm calling on the government to act on this issue. The government needs to look at the law. The law needs to be changed to make it easier to close down fascist organisation and fascist headquarters like the British National Headquarters in Bexley. The law needs to be changed to strengthen the law on incitement to racial hatred. The Commission for Racial Equality has recently made very well-considered proposals to that end, and I believe the government should take them far more seriously than it has done up to now. And above all, the law needs to be changed to make racial harassment a legal offence. We are told by this government that law and order is the #1 political issue. Well, black people want law and order too. And I say to the Minister that if the Home Secretary can come before this House and say that he's going to rush through legislation on the unit fines issue, he's going to rush it through in this Parliament, well, I see no reason why he can't rush through legislation on racist violence and killings as well. Because if fines, unit fines, big fines are upsetting people, well, violence and killing is frightening the black community and is far more appropriate a subject for rush action than the unit fines issue. I do not believe that there is any practical reason why the government cannot bring forward legislation on the issues I have outlined. But above all, I want to say to the House this afternoon that what the black community wants and what Stephen Lawrence's family wants is for his killers to be brought to justice. A number of witnesses have come forward and have said that they saw a gang of 6 white youths stab Stephen Lawrence to death. So far, only 1 person has been charged. What the black community wants is all 6 killers to be brought to justice. There should be no question of people roaming free, boasting how they were able to stab to death a black youngster at a bus stop. I have tried to outline to the House the problems arising from racial harassment and violence. I've tried to convey to ministers and MPs the fear in which some people are living their lives. But despite that, the most noteworthy thing and the most remarkable thing, if you look up and down the country, is that despite the dire predictions of Enoch Powell over a quarter of a century ago, up and down the country, in our great cities, you can still find black people and white people living happily side by side. The extent to which we are today in 1993, a genuinely multiracial and multicultural society, is quite remarkable. You will not find black people and white people living integrated side by side in the same way in cities like Washington and New York in the United States. And I believe the extent to which black and white do live side by side is actually a tribute to the decency and the kindness of ordinary British people, black and white. But racial harassment and racial violence does exist. And the fact is the recession, the pressure on working class people, the unemployment, these things are putting enormous pressure on our communities. It's putting enormous tension. It's making it very difficult. And the message has to go out from this House of Commons this afternoon that for racist bullies and murderers, there is no place to run to, no place to hide. The most disturbing and hurtful thing about the killing of Stephen Lawrence for the black community was the way in which, initially, in the first 48 hours, it was almost entirely ignored by the mainstream media and by the government. The weekend after Stephen Lawrence was killed, only one national newspaper carried the story. And if there is one thing that I believe the black community wish to say to the House this afternoon, it is this: that the black community has lived in this country, well, it's lived in this country for centuries, but there has been a big black presence in British cities ever since the Second World War. And black people didn't come to this country to rely on people's charity and goodwill. Black people came to this country to work, and to a great extent, the progress this country has made since the Second World War, its institutions, its health service, its public services, black people have paid their part as citizens and as workers to build up this country and build up its institutions. And black people are not prepared to stand by and see racial violence reach epidemic proportions. Black people want to know that when there are killings and racist murders in our community, that our feelings are respected, that the killings of black school children are taken as seriously as the killings of white school children. It is easy enough for government ministers and politicians on both sides of the House to play lip service to the issue of racial tolerance. But what I believe all concerned people want to see is, first of all, respect paid to the black community in its grief, respect paid to the Lawrence family in its grief, and going on from that, what people want to see is action from this government. We do not want to see the situation in Britain that we see in France and Italy and Germany, where week in, week out, you hear of racist murders, you hear of hostels and the homes of black people and refugees set alight. We do not need the tide of racism and Nazism, which is engulfing some other European countries, to engulf Britain too. So I call on the government to take this issue seriously, to pay respect to the Lawrence family, but above all, to take the firm action that needs to be taken to show the racists in our midst that their brutality and their violence will not be tolerated. And there is not one law for white people and one law for black people, but that the lives of all British citizens are equally precious in the eyes of the government.
John Austin Walker.